How are you all doing? My name is Rod Cofield. I'm the executive director here. Thank you all so much for coming out this February for our winter lecture series. This year's series is focusing on the people and trades of London town. As most of you hopefully know, in our historic area, we opened up a carpenter shop last October. We haven't started to fully use it yet, but we will this spring. And so we thought that with the opening of the carpenter shop, that would be a great time, or a great reason, to focus this year's winter lecture series on the people and trades of London town. So the first person will be Kyle Dalton. I'll talk about him in just a few moments for his introduction. Next week, Andy Shaw is going to be coming and talking about colonial shipbuilding and shipwrights, the people that built the ships. He helped build the Sultana, which is the frigate based out of Chesapeake. He was also a bosun down at historic St. Mary City on their reconstructed wooden vessel, the Maryland Belle. And he's now in Lewis doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that in the woodworking field. So come out for that because he has some great behind-the-scenes stories about building ships. The week after that will be me. I will be talking about William Brown and the carpenter shop. And then the week after that, one of our board members, Ryan Cox, is going to be coming and talking about the enslaved African experience in the colonial Chesapeake. He works at the Maryland State Archives, and his research focus for the past few years has been on that. So we're really looking forward to this year's winter lecture series, exploring the different activities and types of people that were here in London town. 4 lectures don't do it justice, though. The best way to really understand what's going on is to pick up our calendar of events before you leave and see all the great activities we have planned for the year. It's just the beginning of February, but we have our year jam-packed. We start really with Maryland Day near the end of March on the 21st and 22nd. That Saturday we'll have a silhouette artist here, and that Saturday will also be a Members Appreciation Day. So we're going to turn this room for those that are members into something a little special. Don't know what it is yet. If you have requests, like an on-site masseuse, let me know. I'll see what we can do. I saw a couple of hands raised. Then we get into it in April with some hearth cooking. Enlighten London Town is on Sunday, April 12th. You get to play with electricity that day? Is that what I hear? Okay, that'll be kind of fun. Annual privateer party, big event. If you want to buy your tickets, let me know after the event. Or if you want to donate anything, or either in-kind donation or $5,000. Lauren Silverman, who is our new deputy director, is back there. So if you want to support the privateer party with any donations. And Ruth Clausen is actually helping buying things too. Great fun event. This year we're going to change it up a little bit by moving the tent, but it'll be exciting. No? Yes? Okay. May, plant sale. Music in May series, London Town Symphony will come back out, and they're going to be in the gardens twice in May to do some mini concerts at 1 o'clock. Tales of Beatrix Potter is also happening in May. National Ballet is coming out to bring to life the Tales of Beatrix Potter. And then Saturday, Sunday, June 13th and 14th, Shore Party Weekend here on site. We've arranged to have 3 different maritime groups on site and a lot of living history that weekend. That's just through June. And then we have July through December. Pick up the calendar of events before you leave, though, because there's plenty to do. And if you're sitting in this audience and you're not a member, there's plenty of reasons why you should be. But you're really here to listen to Kyle Dalton, who is our public programs administrator. He's going to be talking about the mariners of London town. And I want to make certain I get his biography correctly. I was just told that just introduce his name and that's all that should matter. But Kyle Dalton comes to us. He used to work at the Maritime Museum in San Diego. And some of you may have seen the blog that was on the screen before he shifted to his PowerPoint presentation. He has a really great blog, British Tars 1740 to 1790. 1740 to 1790. So you post once a week, I think?
Irregularly.
In good weeks, you post once a week. When we're working you hard, it's maybe once a month. But it's a really great resource to learn about the maritime life of the colonial period, and that deeply affected London town. So I'm really happy that Kyle was willing to prepare this presentation today, and it's your show, sir.
Welcome to Historic London Town and Gardens. As Rod said, I am Kyle Dalton, Public Programs Administrator here. And today I'll be talking about the masters and the sailors who lived and worked here in colonial London Town during the 18th century. The 18th century wit Edward Warren wrote in his book, The Wooden World Dissected, that a ship was Old Nick's Academy, where the 7 liberal sciences of swearing, drinking, thieving, whoring, killing, cousining, and backbiting are taught to full perfection. A similar opinion was voiced in a 1752 edition of the Gentleman's Magazine, which described the sailor as a rude, uncultivated savage, with little more human than his form, and wholly insusceptible of all the softer passions. Common sailors were near the bottom of the social hierarchy in 18th century Britain, and often viewed with contempt. Thousands of seafarers, nicknamed Jack Tar, Foremastman, and Tarpaulin, ran away from their ships, committed crimes throughout the British Empire, and could be found at the center of any self-respecting riot. Why was this social class tolerated? What benefit did they offer the colonists and the British people? And what gentleman would willingly put himself in a place of responsibility over the notoriously difficult Jack Tar? The entire reason for London Town's existence lay on the water. In 1683, the Maryland State Colonial Legislature, I should say, was founding the town as part of an effort to regulate the tobacco trade. The exportation of tobacco was of the utmost importance to the colony, and London Town was created specifically to send this cash crop across the Atlantic. Of course, to get across the Atlantic Ocean needed ships, and ships, in turn, are only as useful as the sailors who man them and the masters that command them. By examining the lives of these individuals, we can shed light on a profession that not only sustained, but defined London Town. In order for us to more fully appreciate these lives, we have to understand the economic world into which they were born. The British Empire relied on a number of exports from around the world. Each port and each colony had a special export, a certain item that was sought after. Tea from China, textiles from India, sugar from the Caribbean, slaves from West Africa, indigo and rice from Carolinas, and here in the Chesapeake, tobacco. Throughout the 18th century, tobacco was the main export for the colonies of Virginia and Maryland. Consumed across all of Europe, tobacco was the sole reason for the existence of London Town. As author Arthur Pierce Middleton relates in his book Tobacco Coast, prior to the establishment of port towns like this one, captains would have to dispatch their own sailors miles to the interior to each individual plantation, where they would retrieve the hogsheads of tobacco and roll them back to the ship. This system was inefficient, it increased the likelihood of damage to the product, and desertion by the sailors. By establishing seaports, the legislature ended this practice and made the planters responsible for the transportation of their own tobacco to the coast. At the seaports, it was loaded onto ships and sent overseas. A northerly route to England formed the first leg of a typical voyage. In England, they would trade the tobacco for any number of finished goods. In turn, these goods would be sold off and they returned to the Chesapeake. But the trade winds and currents prevented a direct return by the same route they took to get to England. Instead, they would lead their ships down to the Canary Islands, then the Cape Verde Islands, across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, and finally north along the coast, through the Capes of Virginia, and back into the Chesapeake Bay. This circuitous voyage allowed for the continual acquisition of food and water. It also allowed for commercial opportunity. At each point, there was the chance to sell or trade and acquire more or better goods for sale in the Chesapeake. Although this voyage was a frequent one for sailors, it was not the only one they took from the Chesapeake. Barbados is the second highest trading partner for London Town. There are a lot of documented voyages to Barbados. It's the furthest east of all the major islands in the Lesser Antilles, as you can see here. Marylanders would trade cooperage supplies there for rum. This could be readily sold back home for easy to understand reasons. The Barbados was not the only island to consume cooperage. The Caribbean had a voracious appetite for barrels, hogsheads, pipes, or anything that carried their incredibly valuable sugar to England. Regardless of their destination or cargoes, voyages to and from London town were frequent and largely successful. Aside from luck, the result of a voyage depended on both the sailors that manned the ship and the masters who commanded them. As a seaport, London town was home to numerous sea captains. Captains John Dixon, Christopher Brindle, John Fish, Joseph Cowman, John Lamb, Richard Jones, Patrick Simpson, Anthony Beck, William Strachan, and Alexander Scougal all lived here in London town. These 10 captains commanded at least 38 separate vessels. That is, if we make allowance for ships that are possibly captained by 2 London towners at different times, like the Annapolis or the Frederick. The most prolific of these captains, at least that we know of, are Scougal and Strachan. They commanded a dozen separate vessels each, and these ranged in size from small single-masted sloops to the massive 300 or 400-ton Rumney and Long. A contemporary of Scougal and Strachan's, Anthony Beck, commanded at least 7 vessels, though likely more. The schooner Argyle, as an example, appears in no local records that I can find. I only was able to find it after going to the Rhode Island State Archives, where Beck filed a protest on behalf of the vessel in Providence. As we get earlier in the century, it becomes more and more difficult to track the captains of London town. Some, like Patrick Simpson here, were only captains part-time. He was primarily a merchant and appears to have only dabbled in this trade. Other sea captains, like those shown here, lived in a time before the surviving copies of the Annapolis port records, and many operated before the Maryland Gazette. This makes the task of tracking them exceedingly difficult, so the lack of vessels shown here should not be taken to mean that these are only occasional mariners. Rather, it shows how much work there is left to do on researching these individuals. Sea captains, like those who lived in London town, were an indispensable role in the maritime trade, but not a universally respected one. In a 1736 letter by planter William Byrd II, he wrote, "One may as soon tutor a monkey to speak French, or a Frenchwoman to hold her tongue, as to bring a skipper to higher flights of reason." Despite a level of revulsion at their profession, even critics like Byrd would be forced to admit that London town sea captains had to possess certain skills. Among the most important of these skills was navigation. Navigation was not the exclusive purview of the captain, but it was an art that he had to master. For centuries, European mariners had been able to plot their course on a chart, using something like this, but they had to rely almost exclusively on latitude. Latitude are the horizontal lines that measure distance north or south of the equator. Now, they had been able to do this for centuries before London town was ever established, and early mariners relied a lot on the quadrant. That would be this device here. It's a very simple device. It's fitted with 2 sights at the top and would be used at night. You would sight the North Star, Polaris. Polaris, unlike any other star in the sky, is relatively fixed in its position. So its distance from the horizon, its angle, which is measured by this, only changes based on your position on the globe, not the time of night. So by lining it up and measuring the angle between the horizon and Polaris, you could come to a good understanding of where your latitude was. This was so reliable that they eventually would replace the numbers down here, the actual angle, with names of famous ports. And they would simply sail on that line until they reached their destination. It's not a perfect device. It's more accurate the larger it is. Famous astronomers would have room-sized quadrants. So those that were small enough to be used on a ship were not terribly accurate. And it only works north of the equator, where you can see the North Star. The other issue for sailors was that they couldn't determine longitude in the 18th century. Longitude are the north and south lines that measured away from the prime meridian. Because this was beyond the sailors of the 18th century, it became really important to capture latitude more accurately. And that led to inventions like the octant. The octant was released about 1730. It was independently invented in both America and Britain. And it could determine the latitude with an exactness that far exceeded the quadrant or any other device that came before it. Being introduced in about 1730, it certainly had an effect on London town's robust maritime growth over the next decade. So the captains were skilled, but popular perceptions, even today, of 18th century captains tend to show them as tyrants. This makes some sense, especially when we bear in mind that sailors were considered to be wild and difficult to control. But the stereotype doesn't hold up to the evidence. The exception that proves the rule is Captain James Lowry here, captain of the Molly, a British merchantman that was sailing from Jamaica to London in the winter of 1751. During the course of this voyage, he tied up and beat a sailor to death, which is depicted here. The other members of his crew brought him to trial, and he was sentenced to hang. The witnesses called to give testimony utterly refute the idea that most merchant captains were dictatorial brutes. John Hunt, a veteran sailor, testified in 1752, "I never saw a man flogged on board a merchantman in my life." Another sailor of the same voyage, William Long, echoed this experience. "I have used the seas as 12 years, and I never saw a man tied up on board a merchantman before in my life and whipped." Both men admitted to seeing a good deal of flogging on board naval vessels, but the expectation for merchantmen was apparently quite different. Closer to home, the English Snow Hannah, a slaver, appears in Maryland Vice Admiralty court records. Her captain, Edward Prescott, and mate Harrison Hudson were arrested for repeated barbarity, inhumanity, and ill usage, delivering violent beatings with illegal weapons, to which many of the mariners on board the said Snow fell a sacrifice to the savage and brutal passions of Prescott and Hudson. There's no evidence that any London town sea captains used physical violence to keep their crews in line. Instead, they would have to motivate them with money. A successful voyage meant pay, both for masters and sailors. Sailors would be paid a set rate throughout the voyage based on a wage agreement that had been signed prior to sailing. If a ship were wrecked or lost, pay stopped for both captain and crew. By demonstrating the wealth that they had attained, captains could attract crews by promising them relative safety at sea and steady pay. Legally, the pay of sailors was paramount. This is demonstrated in the Anne Arundel County court records with the 1715 case involving London town's own Stephen West. With the death of Captain John Rees, West went to court to demand back wages for serving as a sailor aboard the ship South River Merchant. The court granted him £2, 3 shillings, and 1,201 pounds of tobacco. Financial success, and by implication steady pay for sailors, was exhibited by London town's sea captains, who purchased plots of land in the town itself. Unfortunately, much of the specific evidence for this has been erased by time, but by cobbling together various sources, we can come at a general idea of where they lived. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the property of mariners in London town is close to the water itself. All of the mariners owned lots along Glebe Bay or Shipping Creek there, and not a lot over on Mitchell Creek, or what we call Almshouse Creek today. This may have been to keep an eye on vessels being refitted or repaired in Shipping Creek. William Shippen, shown here, listed his occupation as shipwright, and a runway advertisement in the Maryland Gazette confirms that he owned boats on Shipping Creek. The eastern half of London town is also the likely location of the London town manufactory, which would have provided some of the stores necessary to support a seaport. Financial success came with a risk. Captains Scougal and Strachan were both captured by French privateers on 2 separate occasions each. The slave ship Jenny, bound from London town from Angola in 1760, was attacked 3 times by a French privateer, and only escaped when the captain armed the enslaved Africans to fight off a boarding party. It is no surprise that Captain Anthony Beck's estate inventory lists a pair of pistols and a cutlass among his possessions, just as Captain Richard Jones' inventory mentions 3 guns, and Strachan's lists a parcel of old sword blades. Danger did not come from the French alone. In 1705, after threatening to seize gunpowder, arm the nearby Indians, burn Annapolis, and kill the inhabitants, 5 men, led by South River resident Richard Clark, took the sloop Little Hannah and were supposed to be pirates. Governor Seymour wrote to warn Virginia of the danger of Clark's pirates on the Chesapeake, but thought they might go a-pirating to Madagascar. Apparently no blood was shed in 1705. The same was not true in 1754. That year, the sloop Hopewell sailed from Annapolis for a short voyage across the Chesapeake to Choptank, where she took on a cargo of barrel staves and barrel heads. Shortly after pulling into the bay, the navigator, the convict servant by the name of John Wright, attacked the captain with a marlin spike and axe. Another crewman, a slave named Anthony Lewis, tied a ballast stone to the captain's body and disposed of him over the side. The mutineers then sailed for the Patuxent River. There, Captain Strachan, our very own Captain Strachan of London Town, was commanding a schooner. A few years before, Strachan had commanded the Hopewell itself on a voyage to Barbados and certainly recognized her, but he knew nothing of the mutiny. He dispatched a boat filled with bread and manned by his slave George Cook and a convict servant named James Manshore, who belonged to the owner of the schooner, London Town merchant James Dick. Both Cook and Manshore were instantly kidnapped by the pirates and held for 6 months. They eventually turned up in South Carolina when the Hopewell ran aground. The sailors were saved, and the pirates were returned to Annapolis for trial. As a warning to others, the pirates were hanged in chains from Hackett's Point, flanking the entrance to the Severn River as we see here. This was as a warning to other sailors. All ships going to Annapolis had to pass by the rotting corpses of the pirates. But in reality, most sailors didn't heed the warning. Life at sea could be difficult and dangerous, what historian Marcus Rediker refers to as between the devil and the deep blue sea. On the one hand, sailors were socially inferior to most colonists and faced socioeconomic pressures that pushed them to sea. On the other, the natural dangers of the ocean kept many away who could be employed in any other labor. Among these dangers were the shipwrecks that plagued London Town's mariners just as they did every other mariner of the 18th century. Captain Alexander Scooba lost his ship, the Nancy, in 1759 off New York City. That same year, an unnamed ship had loaded at London Town, which was wrecked off Bermuda. In both cases, the master and crew were all saved, but Captain James Hubble was not so lucky. After loading his vessel, the Beaumont, on the South River, Hubble went down with his ship when it foundered in 1754 off the Capes of Virginia. Even if the ship were spared from catastrophe, danger still dogged the daily work of common sailors. In 1745, for example, a sailor from the Frederick waded ashore to snag a boat that had gone adrift. He lost his footing and fell into the South River where he drowned. In 1760, Strachan's Betsy ran aground. He sent 5 sailors out in a boat to help haul her off by kedging, but the boat was overset and 2 of the sailors drowned. Aside from these generalities about the dangers of life at sea, though, it's difficult to come at the character of what an average sailor might have been like. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich famously said that well-behaved women seldom make history. By this she meant that most women are invisible to history because society didn't deem them important enough to record. Only the outliers, those who worked against the norm, those who upset the social order, were written about. And that was specifically because they were doing things that were different. To a lesser extent, the same is true of sailors. Jack Tar was most often recorded when he ran away, committed a crime, or upset the social order. This is how we know about most of the sailors of London Town. John Bird fled from Scoogel's ship Annapolis, in, of all places, Annapolis. On this very day, in 1753, Londoner John Flack was caught trying to pickpocket a gentleman outside the ship tavern. Flack was sentenced to transportation to America, where he took up sailmaking in Annapolis and London Town. Apparently the new career did not take because he ran away within only a few months. Sometimes we learn of mariners not because of the crimes they committed, but the crimes that were done to them. Joseph Trout, mate of Scoogel's ship Elizabeth, is a good example of that. In the middle of a summer night in 1750, Trout's cabin was robbed of 14 bottles of rum, a pair of breeches, silver, a pocket watch, shoes, and cash. In a darkly humorous case, Scoogel's vessel Bladen was lying off Annapolis in August of 1745 when a pair of sailors were dispatched in a boat to retrieve one of the fowl that had flown overboard. Apparently they had some kind of disagreement earlier, and the fight resurfaced while they were on the boat. In the words of the Boston newsletter, proceeding from words to blows, they fell into the river, where they continued fighting till both were drowned. Not all sailors were so temperamental and unreliable. William Bicknell was trained at the Royal Dockyards in Portsmouth, where he attained the rank of Master Sailmaker. In 1749, he began his business as a sailmaker and tavern keeper in Annapolis, but also worked out of London Town. It was from here that his servant John Flack ran away. By 1764, Bicknell was aboard the frigate HMS Richmond, continuing his trade as a master sailmaker. We don't know anything about his life in the Royal Navy, except that he was close to the ship's cook, to whom he bequeathed all of his shipboard possessions if he should die in service. Bicknell's connection to London town was one that reflects an important aspect of any seaport: maintenance. As I mentioned earlier, the London town resident William Shippen was a shipwright. He lived along Shippen Creek, and quite possibly he made his living by working on the vessels there. The tavern keeper Edward Rugby was a ship carpenter by trade. I won't be going into detail on precisely what each of these men is doing, because next week, as Rod mentioned, Andy Shaw will be giving a talk about the job of ship's carpenters and shipwrights. What I will say is that labor alone did not sustain the fleet of ships that came to the South River. It was also important to equip those vessels for the long voyage ahead. As Captain John Smith wrote in the early 17th century, the sea possessed neither alehouse, tavern, or inn, nor grocery, poultry, apothecary, nor butcher shop. Ships, unlike any town on the American continent, had to be self-sustaining, at least for a few months. Whenever a ship came into port, it was important to take board fresh provisions and replace the hardware that allowed it to rove. London town was more than happy to provide this. As we can see in this 1773 Maryland Gazette advertisement by London town merchants James Dick and Anthony Stewart, ships could obtain anchors, grapnels, sail dock, and all sorts of ship chandlery and cordage made at Newington Rope Walk, where orders for a ship's rigging of any size may be compiled without a few days' notice. London town did not always have to ship in its rigging. Beginning in 1747, Stephen West advertised for the London Town Manufactory. It was primarily a rope walk, a long and narrow structure in which cordage would be wound into various sizes for standing and running rigging. Skilled labor was recruited to work in the manufactory, and this is likely what brought William Bicknell and his servant John Flack to town. Sailors like Bicknell were drawn to the Chesapeake by their robust trade, and others were drawn by a false belief that it provided protection from impressment. The British Crown had long practiced naval impressment to man their ships. The Royal Navy was continually short of sailors, and to make up for this shortfall, they would deploy press gangs, like what we see here. These were teams of sailors who would comb British ports and physically take men, often unwilling, to serve in the Navy. This legal kidnapping was dreaded by sailors throughout the Empire. There was a brief loophole in the law. The American Act of 1708, sometimes called the Sixth of Anne, forbid the use of impressment against American colonists, deeming it to cause unwarranted damage to the Empire's economy. Both colonists and British sailors believed this act remained in effect, even after British courts seemingly nullified it only a short time after it passed. There was likely no real legal protection for sailors in London town, but they did have reason to be optimistic. There's no evidence that press gangs ever set foot on the South River. Still, the waters of the Chesapeake could spell danger for Jack Tar. With the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War, the door to the Atlantic also became a gateway for invaders. In 1776, the British sloop Otter, which probably looked something like this, sailed into the Chesapeake toward Baltimore, sending out her tenders as she went, seizing prizes all the way. Merchant shipping was at the mercy of this small Royal Navy warship, and Marylanders were shocked into the realization that they had no defense. London town, and more importantly at that time the South River Ferry, were briefly guarded by the South River Militia. The Committee of Safety in Annapolis ordered the colonel, should the man of war and her tenders attempt any landing here, that he be ready to repel them. Barely a month had passed after the Otter was finally turned back before another British warship sailed into the local waters. The Fowey, a frigate that mounted far more guns than the Otter, came to retrieve the deposed Governor Eden, but in so doing upset a delicate truce. The situation quickly devolved, and again the South River Militia was ordered out to repel any violence which may be offered by the said vessel, or her tenders, as also to prevent servants or slaves from making their escape from their masters. Thankfully for London town, neither of these vessels chose to terrorize the South River, but both of them proved the vulnerability of American shipping. London London town was made further vulnerable by its lack of local sailors. Middleton, in his book Tobacco Coast, makes it clear that a majority of sailors in the Chesapeake were British. By his calculations, Maryland could boast only 480 sailors by 1756. And 4 years of war had decreased even that paltry population to only 200. Meanwhile, as Middleton writes, the British-owned vessels trading to the Chesapeake were manned by nearly 4,000. The imbalance of common labor in the maritime trade is further underlined by the fact that virtually none of the common sailors I've mentioned actually lived in London town. This was also true of the slave trade. Slave ships, like this Liverpool slave ship here, were almost entirely captained and crewed by Britons. There were a few Maryland captains who participated in the trade, but there's no evidence that any London town captains did so. This does not exonerate them. William Strachan died owning 15 slaves, Richard Jones 21, Anthony Beck at least 6. It was simply that the English dominated the slave trade, and Maryland captains could generally make more money on shipping tobacco. It's difficult to track ships that sailed directly to London town, but we can say with certainty that at least 2 slave ships sold their cargoes here. The first was the Clapham, Captain Richard Williams, which anchored in the South River in 1733. It may have come here several times before, as early as 1729, but this is not proven. What we can say with certainty is that the Clapham carried over 200 souls from Angola. Nearly 3 decades later, the Jenny, Captain John Wilkinson, arrived in London town in 1760, advertising her 333 slaves for sale in the Maryland Gazette. Interestingly, both vessels traveled from Angola, and both had a history of voyages to Barbados. The Clapham certainly stopped in Barbados in 1729, as you can see here, and the Jenny sold her slaves there on the very same voyage to London town in 1760. This suggests what has already been argued by historians of slavery in the Chesapeake. The colonies of Maryland and Virginia were secondary stops. Remaining cargoes of slaves were sold here only after the best had sold at the best price in the West Indies, or if there were already several slave ships flooding the market in the Caribbean. This appears to have been the case with the Jenny, which started her voyage with 408 slaves and ended with 333, suggesting a fatality rate that was not unheard of in closely packed ships, rather than a healthy and open market in Barbados. Knowing that the slave ships of London town sailed from Angola and stopped in Barbados on the way up, we can confidently reconstruct their route. It should look vaguely familiar. The first leg, which ran from England to the Cape Verde Islands, is the same as that taken by Chesapeake tobacco ships. Here's where it takes a different turn. Many would stop at the Ivory Coast, hugging the western coast of Africa, where they could barter with local warlords and slavers through European intermediaries who were permitted to live on the coast. The ships bound for London town sailed to Angola. Unlike the other sources for slaves, Angola was not primarily controlled by Africans. The Portuguese had begun colonizing the coast of Angola centuries before, where they had traded guns to the local people, giving them an advantage over their rivals. It was here that the hundreds of slaves to be exported to London town were purchased. The next leg was often the most harrowing, the dreaded Middle Passage, which was plagued with disease and death for both the cargo and crew. This is likely what happened to the 18% of Jenny's enslaved cargo. In the case for London town-bound vessels, the next stop was Barbados. Finally, having most likely sold some of the enslaved on that island, the ships would turn their bows toward the capes of Virginia and into the Chesapeake. Once the slaves had been sold, the slave ships would load with local goods, most often cooperage and tobacco, before returning to England. This voyage was much longer than those taken by tobacco ships, often lasting well over a year. The slave trade is certainly the most distasteful of all the voyages taken in the 18th century, but there was no real difference between the sailors of tobacco ships, slave ships, or even warships. The common pool of labor within the British Empire made little or no distinction between sailors carrying one sort of cargo or another. Sailors within the empire shared a common culture that crossed the globe. Jack Tar could be recognized in an instant simply by the clothes he wore, whether he was in Canton, China, or London town, Maryland. Almost universally, sailors wore a short jacket of blue wool, It lacked a collar or turned-back cuffs of other professions, preventing unnecessary additions from catching while he worked with lines and hooks. Over his breeches, Jack wore a pair of petticoat trousers, a sort of apron made of cheap fabric to prevent tar or pitch from staining the garment beneath. We can see an example of that in the figure on the left here, which is taken from the famous John Singleton Copley painting, Watson and the Shark. The petticoat trousers are pushed up dramatically by the wind, leaving no doubt that he is wearing breeches beneath, unlike what they wear beneath kilts. If he didn't wear breeches, a sailor wore trousers. Made from the same canvas that propelled his ship through the waves, the trousers were long-legged garments that ended somewhere between the bottom of the calf and top of the ankle. Atop his head, the sailor often wore a cocked hat, what we today call a tricorn. Interestingly, many sailors depicted wearing their cocked hats backward, as we can see here. These hats were also smaller than those worn by other professions, to keep them from interfering in their work. In a 1762 edition of the London Chronicle, the author writes that sailors wear the sides of their hats uniformly, tacked down to the crown, and look as if they carried a triangular apple pasty upon their head. At other times, he wore a short-brimmed hat, known commonly as a round hat, which provided better protection against the sun, but it also didn't stick out far enough to catch the rigging. Sailors' clothing was practical and efficient. It changed very little over a century in which fashion was rapidly progressing. Some hints of sailors' clothing in the 18th century can still be seen today, in the bell-bottom trousers of the Navy, or in the peacoats that have broken the barrier between working clothes and a fashion statement. The common culture of sailors was emphasized through fashion, but also through hardship. We've already discussed the dangers of storms, shipwrecks, and lethal accidents that haunted the sailors in their daily routine. Hardship also goes beyond the sudden disaster. Many of you probably recognize this as a ship's biscuit, or hardtack. With good reason, this is the most recognizable part of a sailor's diet. The piece we see here was given as a gift to an Englishwoman in 1784. It is still in the collection of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England. It has withstood the test of 2.5 centuries. Needless to say, ship's biscuit is remarkable for its shelf life. Dried or salted peas, beef, and pork would be loaded along with ship's biscuit on virtually every vessel that sailed the Chesapeake. Most often, these ships would also load livestock, like chicken or goats. And though often taken aboard, fresh fruits and vegetables did not last very long at sea. Long voyages, like those taken by the slave ships, quickly exhausted the supply of fruits and vegetables, leading to a high risk of scurvy. Scurvy is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, and has always haunted sailors. It caused lethargy, swelling, bleeding of the gums, and, if left untreated, gradual painful death. Thankfully, sailors of London town lived in a time when the cure for scurvy was fairly well known. As early as the late 16th century, it was determined that an increase in citrus would prevent and reverse the course of scurvy. That didn't stop quack doctors from hawking snake oils. In this 1762 Maryland Gazette advertisement, the reader is assured that the essence of water dock can cure both scurvy and leprosy, all for the low price of 7 shillings a bottle. Not all shipboard diseases were caused by diet either. Ship fever was another common ailment, and one that spread quickly in the confined spaces of a ship. Ship fever is what they called typhus in the 18th century, a virus that is spread through lice. The dirty and cramped conditions aboard a ship accelerated the spread of ship fever, sometimes called jail fever, especially vessels carrying convict servants from England. Disease, shipwrecks, press gangs, privateers, mutinies, accidents, and social pressures all presented challenges to the sailors and masters of London town. Despite these dangers, it was the efforts of countless mariners on hundreds of vessels that made London town an important seaport in colonial Maryland, and certainly the most important in the county. In Michelle Kearns-Nosarito's Training Colonial Anne Arundel County, she demonstrated that between the years of 1705 and 1762, 231 voyages made the South River their destination. The only other river in the county that comes even close is the Severn, with only 117. This was not to last. As I mentioned earlier, the French and Indian War took a staggering toll on Maryland shipping. Many tobacco vessels were seized by French privateers, including at least 2 that were captained by London towners. Maryland's already slim supply of sailors was depleted. More importantly, a stagnant tobacco trade choked the town of its maritime trade. The late 1740s saw a rise in the cost of tobacco and a decline in the actual crop. This meant many of the ships sailing to Maryland for tobacco left with some other good or half empty. Given that London town was based on a single export, it was not equipped to handle this decline in traffic. Exacerbating these major concerns, minor factors also came into play. As Donna Russell points out in her work, Historic London Town, Maryland, the brackish water just offshore allowed the teredo worm to survive. It's a seaborne creature that eats through the wooden sides of a ship and eventually causes it to ruin it, to rot. Freshwater ports gained popularity over tidal estuaries. A further decline in the tobacco trade during the American Revolution, the rise of Baltimore as the most dominant seaport in Maryland, and the laying of new roads all made London town redundant. By 1767, the London-based Modern Gazetteer deemed the seaport a small, inconsiderable place. Still, during the golden years of the mid-18th century, London town played a vital role in the economy of Maryland. This was a role that was born on the backs of common sailors, who walked the streets here and led by the captains who called this town home. Thank you. Before I open it up to questions, a quick plug here. This ship is the Hermione. She's a French ship that was started construction in 1997. They just finished building it. It's sailing here this summer, not here to London town, but to America. She'll be docking in Annapolis in mid-June. The weekend before she arrives, we're having our shore party here. Shore party weekend, as Rod mentioned, we'll have between 2 and 4 vessels that are actually going to be docking out here, reconstructed historical boats that will be sailing the South River. And we'll have a number of sailors and living history interpreters on site to talk about the maritime trade of London town. So make sure you come back for that. But I'll open the floor for any questions that we might have. Yes?
Am I correct in thinking that sailors in general didn't know how to swim? I've heard that somewhere.
Judging by the number that drowned, probably. I heard that story a lot. When I worked on the tall ships at the Maritime Museum of San Diego, all of the sailors would say, oh, it's bad luck, you shouldn't know how to swim, it's bad luck. But I've never actually seen any written sources for that in the 18th century. So it's hard to say. Many of them did not write, so it's a little difficult to come at that one. But again, judging by the number that drowned just from falling in the water, there's a good chance they didn't know. Yes?
Was this site chosen because of the ferry or some other set of...
The ferry, I think, was certainly a factor. The ferry did exist before the town was established. I think it's also because William Burgess owned this land, and he had some pull in the legislature, so it made sense then for him to use his influence to get that land bought, and for him to get a little bit of money out of it. Yeah, I don't think it really sticks out. Knowing other seaports, it doesn't stick out to me geographically as being a really, really good place for a seaport. I think it probably had more to do with the ferry and William Burgess's influence. Yes?
So the shipwrights basically were repairing the ships that came here. Did they build any ships here?
It's difficult to say. We do know that there are ships built on the South River. And oftentimes, we saw some of the ships earlier in the presentation that were listed. One of them is named the London Town. Oftentimes, ships would be named after the place they were built. Baltimore Town, the Snow Annapolis, Alexandria. The Snow Alexandria was the first one built in that city. So it's possible that there were slipways somewhere nearby. We know they were built on the South River, but where exactly, I don't really know, unfortunately. That will require more research. Yes?
I understand that you have sailing in all ships.
Yes, just as a deckhand. I didn't get to go aloft in the fall.
We're glad you did the fall.
So am I.
Years of it. So how much time did you spend at sea?
Not that much. I was primarily an education instructor, I did spend a lot of time on steamboats as a deckhand, but that's entirely different. So I did spend a lot of time on the ships themselves, but it was mainly school tours, public programs, that kind of thing. So a lot of that didn't actually go out on the water. I'm only kind of a sailor.
So, what would a favorite story be about your experience on the water?
Gosh, good one. Well, there was a time when we went sailing out on the California, which is the Coastal Schooner, which is the official tall ship for the state of California. If you've seen Amistad, it was the ship they used as the Amistad. And it was going out for a battle sail, where other ships come to visit and they sail around and fire their guns off. And this was back in the 90s, and it was a Monday, which is an odd day for a sail, but it was when the other ships could join us. And it was the day after the local football team had lost a big playoff game. And one of the passengers on board, everyone slowly realized, was the head coach of the football team. So there's a lot of kind of weird glances at each other, kind of odd little bits, but he didn't really want anybody to notice him because he made some bad calls. So it was kind of a strange, awkward moment to go sailing, but that one was fun.
Thank you.
Yes.
You talked about the sailors escaping. This was from their contract?
In a sense, yes. Now, some of them would flee, say, the passions of the officers. I mentioned earlier the Hannah, the English snow that they sued the master and the captain of. Those sailors all deserted. They all ran away to get away from it. And they were suing to get their money. If you run away, your contract ends.
Right.
You don't get that money. Some ships would even have the contracts extend 48 hours after the voyage ended to make sure the sailors would help unload the ship. So by running away, they should have given up their opportunity. The Maryland Vice Admiralty Court said, no, they are entitled to that pay. They were leaving not the ship, but the violence of the officers. So that's one reason they might do it. Another is sheer boredom. These guys are on a ship for months at a time, and the moment they see land and they see civilization, they just want to get off. Other times they're pursuing other commercial opportunities. They'll join other ships that are more likely to pay them more. There's a variety of factors that come into it. Others, as I mentioned with the mutineers, that whole crew, they were all convict servants and slaves. They weren't getting paid. So for them, there's nothing really to lose by leaving or running away.
The ones who were under contract were forfeited their money.
They were, yes. So there has to be something going on there for them to give up what they worked months for. They are paid month by month. They don't get that until the voyage concludes. Yes?
You mentioned snow several times. Is that
It's a rig. It's a type of sail. At the top there on the right, we have a brigantine, two-masted vessel, square sails on the foremast, and the mainmast, the second one back, has only a spanker there. Well, a snow has what's called a trysail. It's a sail that's roughly triangular in shape, so it'll look like the brigantine there. That's what a snow would look like.
okay?
It's very common in the Chesapeake. You don't see it in a lot of other places. The Royal Navy used a good number of them as tenders. They follow around the really big ships of the line, these like 120-gun ships, just as guard ships or for carrying stores, that kind of thing. So those are largely merchant vessels.
The other question I had is, do you have any idea how many men were impressed into service in London town or Annapolis?
In London town, none. There were no press gangs that ever came to the South River. Annapolis, there weren't very many. Part of the issue was that Maryland, as I mentioned earlier, really didn't have a lot of local sailors. The sailors would often be pressed at sea itself. But there are some isolated incidents of press gangs here in the Chesapeake. In the American Revolution, I believe 1777, there was a Continental Navy captain who sent press gangs ashore in Baltimore. He was officially reprimanded by the governor, by the admiral, by everybody, but he kept doing it. He didn't really care. He kept sending his guys ashore, and the mayor was begging him to stop because people stopped coming to town. It's the only instance of any American naval officer ever using impressment. It was highly illegal. The Royal Navy would tend to do it at sea. That was also a way of getting around the Sixth Amendment, that act I mentioned earlier. That way they didn't even have to contest it in the courts, which would say, well, we gotta wait, is this act still legitimate? Has it been nullified by the courts? Rather than take it there, they would just do it at sea. Oh, we're not on land, it doesn't count. So that was usually how it happened here. There are a lot more press gangs in New England. Because they have so many more sailors up there, they're much more likely to do the pressing up there on land.
Thank you.
Yes?
Did they carry passengers?
They did. Passengers were a rather important part of the trade. Usually these were individuals if they were paid. Otherwise, the passengers were essentially cargo, convict servants and slaves. And that was often how they were treated, as cargo. That's why ship fever was such a big deal. That's why so many people died on that middle passage. So it was not pleasant if you were poor. If you had the money, you could get a cabin, and there usually wouldn't be that many actually going on the voyage. But there was also no stigma against women or children on a ship. Today, there's some sailors that claim superstitiously that women were allowed. They didn't have that superstition back then. They didn't care. Men, women, children, everybody could sail. Yes?
What was the natural progression to obtaining your captain's papers?
There was no licensing. There was no real standards set aside from can you do it. The captain of the Hopewell, for example, the one who was murdered by the mutineers, appears in no records anywhere as a captain. It appears that that was his first voyage. He does not show up in the Annapolis port records. He does not show up in the newspapers. The guy's a ghost before he's murdered. So there's no real standard set for it. There's no testing. You just had to possess the skills to do it. Most likely, these were men who were brought on board as some sort of supercargo. Stephen West, for example, who sues to get his back wages, that lives locally here. He's paid more than the average sailor. He's probably doing something else. And in doing that other task, he's also gaining the skills that he could later use to become a captain, become a master. In the Navy, it's different. You do actually have to go through tests. You have to enter as a midshipman. You can't just buy your rank. And at that point, you have to train. You have to spend years at sea. And you have to pass a board. They actually set up admirals, and the admirals all sit there, or post captains. They all sit there and they test you over and over again. They'll throw situations at you. And you have to answer those questions to their satisfaction to get promoted. But in the merchant service, you can do it. You got it.
You got a ship, you can get that?
Pretty much.
So then would the captains or the ship's masters sort of rely on sailors who really knew what they were doing and they were just sort of overseas?
Largely, yes. It also depended on the size of the vessel. As we saw with Schuylkill and Strachan, they're commanding vessels of widely different sizes. If they're commanding the Rumney Long, this 300, 400-ton vessel, they've got 16 to 32 sailors on there. They really can just sort of let the sailors do their thing and tell them how, what they want it to do. Take me that direction. But if they're on a sloop, a single-masted vessel that's very small, their crews can be very small. The Hopewell Mutiny, had only 4 people aboard, including the captain. That's probably why they kidnapped those 2 servants before they tried to make a run for the Caribbean, is they didn't have enough people to get that far. But it's a very small ship. In that case, the captain is not just getting orders. He's actually getting his hands on the lines. He's doing all the work. You cannot afford to step back and look at for him. Yes?
Could you speak a little bit about the rise of Baltimore as a port? It was my impression that it didn't really become a major port until around the time of the Revolutionary War.
And that is true, yes. It really did take off then, especially with the rise of privateering. That was big for Baltimore. That's when it really took off. And that was really one of the final nails in the coffin of Londontown. Londontown was already on its way out by that point. We do see ships arriving here in the 1760s, but there's few of them. Not nearly anything compared to what it was in the 1740s. So when you get to the Revolution, the tobacco trade virtually ends. And you've got this huge rise in privateering out of Baltimore. That's it. There was a question? Yes, ma'am.
The Tobacco Act in Virginia established ports of inspection, and then the effect upon London Town after that, or Maryland after that. I think by 1750, that was the agricultural decline.
And that was one of the reasons that they passed those acts, was to try and stop the bleeding out of the tobacco trade.
In that case, the tobacco was brought into certain selected ports because they were getting too many complaints about weeds mixed in with the tobacco, and the consumers in London did not like that.
That's true, yes.
And that's how Richmond, I imagine, is still made tobacco port on the James.
In 1730, Virginia passed a Tobacco Inspection Act. The planters had sent so much damaged tobacco, or what they call trash tobacco mixed with weeds, to England that it actually started damaging the market. Prices for tobacco plummeted. So they tried to solve this by passing the Tobacco Inspection Act in 1730. Maryland didn't do the same thing until 1747. And that 17-year gap really hurt London town, as well as the rest of Maryland. Many people referred to Maryland tobacco as Maryland trash. There was a question back? Yes. Yes.
My question also has to do with tobacco. Do you have any information or resources or books that I could go to find more information about the negotiations of or the trading of the tobacco with the captains or the owners of the ships? And the tobacco wasn't grown right here in London town. It was grown in villages or surrounding towns. Are there any resources that talk about from whence the tobacco came and how was it transported? I just need to know the progression of the farmer cutting tobacco, raising tobacco, and getting it from his farm to the ship for cargo. And also, what role did the slaves were cargo too? They were imported.
Yes.
And I'd like to know, they were traded mainly for to the farmers to help with the tobacco, or were they also grown to be artisans, carpenters, tradesmen? What resources can I go to really delve into this more?
There are, to start with the first one, with the process of growing tobacco, the transportation of it, the book that I would recommend above all others would be one that I've mentioned a couple of times in the talk here, Arthur Pierce Middleton's Tobacco Coast. Tobacco Coast is for sale actually in our gift shop, with that little plug in there. It's a very thorough treatment. It's very good. It covers basically everything to do with the tobacco trade, from the moment it's planted to the moment that it winds up in a clay pipe in France. It's a wonderful book. It's a great way to cover that. As far as the experience of slaves, there was a book that was created by the Mariners Museum in Newport, I believe. It's in Virginia, the Mariners Museum. And the book was called The Middle Passage. It's a series of essays that detail each part of the slave trade from the moment that they're taken in Africa to decades after that, centuries after that here in America. What does that slave trade mean? Tobacco and slaves is another good one. That's a good sort of middle ground between Tobacco Coast and Middle Passage. It blends both of those topics together very well. So I would really recommend Tobacco and Slaves, Tobacco Coast, and Middle Passage.
Also sold in our gift shop.
Yes, that's also sold in our gift shop. Tobacco and Slaves. Another book, just sort of generally on mariners, which will be in our gift shop in the next day or two, is Marcus Rediker's Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea talks about the experience and the lives of average sailors in the first half of the 18th century. So those are all great books to use for reference. Yes?
I was wondering if you could tell us what these other
Yeah, I can do a
tools are.
quick rundown on some of these. This here is a lead line, not surprisingly made of lead. There is a small gap in the bottom here, and this will be filled with tallow, beef fat. This would then be tossed off of the ship, and when it did, it would hit the water and sink, and as it sank, knots would pass by. And each knot would be a fathom apart. This is a demonstration piece, the knots are a little too close together. But when you counted these, and it hit the bottom, you would know how deep the water was. It was a way of preventing your ship from running aground.
Mark Twain.
Exactly. And when you pulled it back up, the tallow would have grabbed whatever was on the seafloor. Broken shells, sand, rocks, that kind of thing. So by using this actually, this was an important tool for any sailor at any seaport. But this was especially useful for sailors coming into the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is a narrow, or rather a gradual rise. It's not a sharp shelf like you have on the Pacific coast. It's very slow. And the type of soil on the bottom also changes very gradually. So when you find the depth and you see what's on the bottom there, you can actually tell fairly fairly well how far you are from the Capes of Virginia, from the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. It is all mud in a way. This is an alidade. It's a corruption of the Arabic term for ruler, the ruler, alidade. It's just a spyglass set on top of a compass. I mentioned earlier that they would use latitude and longitude, or less longitude, more latitude, to find their location at sea, but when you're close to shore, you don't have to do that. This uses triangulation. Using the spyglass, you would sight a fixed point, say a lighthouse, a rock, something you can find on a map. You would then sight another fixed point, again, a lighthouse, a rock, whatever, and using your chart, you would draw lines through them based on the bearing you got from your compass. Wherever those lines intersected is where you were. It was a fairly quick and easy way to get a good general position at sea. This is a ship log. If any of you have seen the movie Master and Commander, this shows up a number of times. This ship here is tossed into the water behind the ship. There's a small lead weight here. That goes off the ship, and once it goes a certain distance, it drags behind. This colored knot will show up. When that colored knot shows up, a 28-second glass is turned. This continues to fall behind the ship until all that sand is run out. When that sand runs out, you hold it. Every knot that is passed by is distance. It's 1.151 miles, or a nautical mile, a sea mile. And that tells you how fast you're going. So tossing this off the back is a way of measuring speed. That becomes helpful with this. This is a traverse board. And this is a way for sailors to come with dead reckoning. Dead reckoning is getting a general idea of where you are at sea based on speed, and based on time, and based on direction. Up here is a compass rose. Using your compass, you just mark what direction you're going. Every half hour, a peg is set in the direction of your ship. And the next half hour, you put another one in whatever direction you're headed then. And you keep doing so until all the pegs are gone. Each time you put one of these, you also put one down here to mark your speed at sea. So 4 holes, 4 knots, 4 nautical miles per hour. And you keep doing this until the end of the watch, 4 hours. This is then taken by the navigator of the ship, who records the distance and the speed, or rather the direction and the speed. Using this, you can pretty well come to an idea of where you are based on where you began. It's a way of sort of tracking it through your chart. And this one's pretty self-explanatory, it's a compass.
Only some people could use these tools, or could...
It depended. The ship log is easy enough that it could be used by pretty much anybody. They would just toss it off the back and count the knots as they go by. The alidade is a little bit more complex. You're more likely to get a navigator to do that. But the lead line was done by an average sailor. He would just toss it off the back and shout the depth back to whoever was at the helm, at the wheel. The traverse board can be used by anybody. It's very simple to learn, very quick. I was using that at an event in Alexandria for the celebration of the war in 1812. And we had blind visitors who were able to do it. It's so easy and so intuitive, you could do it in the darkest night. So yeah, that's something anybody can do. Now actually calculating it, that probably would take a navigator. Yes?
Go back to the tobacco trade. If the plantations were sending their tobacco into London town, was there, were the ships that were going to be transporting it, were they going to be there? Or in other words, I guess where I'm going is, was there an agent or was there a warehouse where this would be kept, or would the tobacco not be sent until the ship was there, or would the ship know that it had to be there at a certain time? Or how was that arranged?
Based on the anecdotal evidence that I've read on that, prior to the Tobacco Inspection Act, there were tobacco warehouses here. This is because we see them show up in court records now and then. One of them was burned down as an act of arson, so we know that there was a tobacco warehouse here. Most likely, as would happen in other ports, it was being put into warehouses here and stored, where the factors, the agents working on behalf of the planters, would then sell it to the ships. The captain would act as the agent of whoever the ship owner was. Sometimes the captain was the ship owner. And they would barter out a price then. Usually the ships would come in to the South River, they'd anchor offshore, and they would advertise their prices. They would actually say, hey, this is how much I'm willing to pay per hogshead, per pound, per what have you. And then they would be taken out there and sold to them. So obviously there's going to be more competition if there's more ships out there.
Now, is there ever any evidence that, say, a captain slash owner would purchase goods and run up and down the river, could be South River, could be James River, whatever, selling these goods and so forth, and there was stopping off at houses or plantations or wherever, and, you know, as a tinker, if you will? And would that ever happen, or is that just,
It appears that by the time that London Town becomes a proper seaport, an important seaport, that's not really happening. There are enough merchants in town that you're really going to make more money doing it rather than going from place to place. It's also sort of a one-stop shop. It's a
yeah,
lot
it's
easier
so
to
hard,
unload
it's so hard to
goods.
get around it. I mean, you pretty much combine waterways and so forth. I was just wondering, you know, if it would be to inland's advantage to try and take the goods to the client.
It wouldn't surprise me if there were a few that did that, and you do see that with smuggling. If you don't go through the seaports, they can't register you. So you do see that here and there, but I think largely it was more beneficial to go to a single seaport and just take care of it all at once. That also decreases the chance of desertion.
To stop that sort of thing was one of the reasons London Town was established.
Right. To get them to just go to a single seaport, get it all taken care of, and
Right,
go.
and also make sure the taxes were collected.
Yes, that's important. Yes.
But after, you say 1747, when Maryland copied Virginia and passed an inspection, that's about the high end of London Town, because like today, politics played a part. And London Town, I think, was left off that list.
Tobacco inspection.
And decline
Yes.
started. Who got the inspection
Richard Beard on the other side of the river.
on the other side?
Initially, it went to,
No, on the other side of this river.
All right, so,
in 1747, it initially went to Howard's Point, just down the way. That burned down. Yeah, that burned down in the 1750s, and they moved it across the river. But that did have a negative effect on London Town.
Yeah.
We do see sort of a slide after that.
so I have to change my presentation and say, this is what gave Baltimore a kick.
Yes. Well, thank you all for coming to visit